for every soldier whose name cannot be spoken, and every family that never understood why. Part 1. The son they thought they knew. Chapter 1. The weight of a name. The Calloway house smelled like money and expectation. It was the kind of house designed by an architect whose name appeared in magazines, furnished by someone whose taste cost more per hour than most people earned in a day. Every room carried a quiet authority, dark mahogany bookshelves lined with volumes that had actually been read, Persian rugs chosen not for show but because Richard Calloway had walked into a shop in Istanbul 30 years ago, with nothing in his pockets, and told himself that one day he would own something like that. And he had. He always did what he said he would do. That was the thing about Richard Calloway that his children had learned before they learned to ride bicycles. The man finished what he started, and he expected the same from the people who carried his name. George had grown up in this house, knowing all of its sounds. The particular creak of the third stair, the way the kitchen pipes knocked every morning at 6:15 when his father ran the shower, the low hum of the study's air filter, which ran even in winter because Richard Calloway believed in clean air and controlled environments. George knew the house so well that he sometimes felt he knew it better than he knew himself, and in his quieter moments he suspected that was exactly what the house had been built to do. He was 18 years old, and he was about to break his father's heart. He had not planned the timing. The request to come to the study had arrived at breakfast, delivered in his father's particular brand of non-negotiable casualness, the kind where a suggestion is not a suggestion at all. Come by the study after lunch, George. I want to talk about next steps. As though George's entire future were a project with a timeline and deliverables. He knocked twice and entered. The study was exactly as it always was, orderly, warm-lit, smelling of paper and the cedar of Richard's humidor. His father sat behind the desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the posture of a man who worked even when he wasn't working. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up from the paper he was signing. George sat, he waited. He had learned growing up in this house that patience was a form of power. His father finally set the pen down and looked at him with the focused expression he used for important meetings. Not unkind, never unkind, just precise. Your SAT scores came in, Richard said. I know. 1580. A pause that held pride in it, carefully measured. That's not a score, George. That's a door opening. He leaned back. I've already spoken with the admissions director at Harvard Business School's undergraduate program. With your scores, your extracurriculars, and our family's relationship with the institution, your acceptance is a formality. You'd start in the fall. George said nothing. Your brother is already a vice president at the firm. By the time you graduate, he'll be positioned for CEO, and that's always been the plan for Marcus. But you, Richard opened his hands, a gesture of genuine generosity. You don't have to follow the same road. You graduate, you come in, work 2 years at the firm to understand the foundation, then take your ideas and I'll back you. Your own subsidiary, your own brand. You'd be your own boss, George. Not working under your brother, working alongside the family. Building something with your name on it. He said it the way architects describe blueprints, like the building was already standing. George looked at his father for a moment, at the silver that had come into his temples, at the hands that had built everything from nothing, from a broken apartment in a city that hadn't wanted Richard Calloway to succeed, from a mother who worked 2 jobs, from a father who was absent in all the ways that mattered. George respected his father. He genuinely did. He said, I'm going to join the Navy. The room went still. Richard's expression did not change immediately. It traveled from attention to confusion to something that took a moment to arrange itself into the shape of anger. But first, for just a fraction of a second, George saw something else move across his father's face, something older and more private than anger. Fear. Then it was gone. I'm sorry, Richard said, and his voice had gone flat in the way it did when he was controlling himself. What did you say? I want to enlist. I want to go through selection for special operations. George kept his voice level. This is what I want to do, special operations. His father repeated the words the way you repeat something in a foreign language you don't speak. Then, you want to take orders from some 25-year-old with a 90 IQ, run through mud, scream, carry sandbags on a beach. He stood up. George, I've spent 20 years building something. I have planned your future with more care than you know. You cannot. You planned a future. George said quietly. You didn't plan my future. You planned the future you wanted for me. That is the same thing when you're 18 years old and you don't know what the world. I already decided, Dad. The words landed like a door closing. Richard Calloway stared at his son. For perhaps the first time in George's memory, his father looked at him and did not know what to say. The silence stretched between them, and in it George heard the house's familiar hum, the air filter, the distant kitchen, the weight of everything this family had built. This is my dream, George said. I don't want to live inside yours anymore. I want my own life. Chapter 2. What his grandmother told him. There were stories in George Calloway's childhood that lived in a different register than everything else. His grandmother's stories. Eleanor Calloway, his father's mother, the woman Richard had come from before he remade himself, was a small woman with large hands and eyes that held a stillness George had never found in any other person. She had married a soldier, she had buried a soldier, and she had spent the intervening decades carrying his memory with the quiet discipline of someone who understands that real love does not diminish with time. It compounds. His name was Thomas Calloway, Staff Sergeant, Special Forces, a man who had gone to places with no names on public maps, who had done things that would never appear in any official history, who came home between deployments smelling of places his family could not follow, and looked at his wife and child with an expression of such fierce tenderness that Eleanor said it almost hurt to witness. She told George these stories not because she had planned to pass something on, but because George had asked. He was 7 years old the first time, sitting in her kitchen while she made tea, and he had found a photograph in the drawer she sent him to for spoons. A young man in uniform, jaw squared, eyes direct, holding his helmet at his side with the ease of someone who belonged in it. "Who is that? That is your grandfather," before he went away. "Where did he go?" She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her made a decision. "Sit down, George. Let me tell you." The stories were not glorified. Eleanor was too honest for that. She told him about the loneliness of waiting, about the calls that didn't come when expected, and the dread that lived in that silence, about the day the men in dress uniforms came to her door, and how she had known the moment she saw them, known in the way the body knows before the mind is willing to understand. But she also told him about Thomas the man, about the letters he wrote, filled with small observations, a bird he'd seen, the way light fell on a certain mountain, a joke a teammate had told, about the way he spoke of his brothers in arms, not with bravado, but with love, the specific love of people who have trusted each other with their lives and found each other worthy of that trust. He said, Eleanor told him once, that the hardest thing was not the danger. It was the impossibility of explaining to people who hadn't lived it what it felt like to be part of something that mattered that much. To be small in yourself, but part of something enormous. George was 12 when she told him that. He didn't fully understand it, but it settled into him somewhere below understanding, in the place where things that will eventually shape you take root before you know they're growing. By the time he was 15, he knew what he wanted. By the time he was 18, he was ready to say it out loud. Chapter 3. Dinner Table. His father chose to announce it at dinner. George had not expected that, though perhaps he should have. Richard Calloway processed his frustrations laterally. He brought them into rooms where witnesses existed, where the social pressure of the family could be applied as a moderating force. The dinner table was where the Calloway family's negotiations happened. His mother, Patricia, heard it with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Your son," Richard said, which was what he always said when he was dissociating himself from a problem, "wants to become a soldier. He doesn't want to stay with me." Patricia set her fork down slowly. She looked at George with an expression he recognized, the one that moved rapidly through several emotions before settling on the one she could manage. She was a woman of genuine warmth and deep anxieties, and she loved her children with an intensity that sometimes expressed itself as fear of the world on their behalf. "George," she said carefully, "is this true?" "Yes," he said. She looked at her plate. He watched her processing it, the danger of it, the distance of it. He thought she would argue. Instead, she asked quietly, "Is this what you really want?" "More than anything," he said. She nodded once, slowly. Then she picked up her fork and said nothing, which was not agreement but was something more honest than argument would have been. Marcus had no such restraint. His brother was 24, already vice president, already wearing the lean satisfaction of a man who had followed the script and found the script rewarding. He had their father's jaw and their father's confidence. And George had always thought about 60% of their father's actual intelligence, which he compensated for by making up the remainder in volume. "You want to run around and scream?" Marcus said, shaking his head with a smirk that contained genuine bafflement. "Do push-ups in the rain, get orders from people who couldn't get into college." He gestured at everything around them, the table, the house, the life. "You could have this, George. And you want to go fill out paperwork?" George looked at his brother for a long moment. He thought about his grandfather, about Eleanor saying, "To be small in yourself, but part of something enormous." "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what I want." The dinner continued. No one finished their food. Chapter 4. Departure. The morning he left, the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when they are holding something. Claire found him in the hallway, backpack at his feet. She was 20, still in college. And she had always understood George in the particular way that overlooked children of accomplished families understand each other, sideways in the periphery, through shared silences. She hugged him without preamble. A real hug, the kind that says, "I don't know how to say this in words, so here. Take care of yourself," she said into his shoulder. Actually, take care of yourself, not just don't die care. "Real care? I will. Promise me." "I promise." She stepped back and looked at him with wet eyes she refused to let spill. He loved her for that. She nodded once, like a decision, and went back down the hallway. Marcus was not home. He had not come home the night before, and George understood this as a statement. He had no expectations otherwise. His father, George, did not know this until later, when his mother mentioned it quietly in the car, had stood at the study window and watched him walk out the front door, had stood there until the car turned the corner and George was gone, had not come to the door, had not said goodbye. His mother drove him to the terminal herself. She did not lecture him in the car. She did not cry, though he knew she wanted to. She talked about small things, whether he'd packed enough warm socks, whether he had the phone number of her sister who lived near the base. Small concrete things that were her way of staying close to the surface of what was happening, because if she went deeper, she would come apart. At the terminal, she held him for a long time. "You are a good person," she said. "Whatever happens, whatever you become out there, you are a good person and I love you and you call me when you can." "I will, Mom, and George." She pulled back and looked at him, and for a second all the careful surface was gone and it was just her face without management. "Your grandfather would have been proud." He didn't know she knew about the grandfather stories. He had never told her. He held that knowledge all the way to the base, and for a long time after. Part 2. The Making of a Ghost. Chapter 5. Selection. What most people do not understand about the kind of soldiers George wanted to become is that the training is not designed to make you stronger. It is designed to find out who you already are when everything else has been removed. The comfortable things go first, then the sleep, then the certainty that the suffering has any logical endpoint. You are cold for so long that cold stops being a sensation and becomes simply the medium you exist in, the way fish exist in water. Your body stops being yours in the old sense. It becomes a set of functions you manage, a machine you are responsible for keeping operational regardless of what it wants. And in that space, stripped of everything that ordinarily tells you who you are, you find out what's underneath. Some men find nothing. They quit, and there is no shame in it. The instructors always say this, and they always mean it, because the men who quit are not weak. They are simply honest about what they found. Honesty is its own kind of courage. George found something he didn't have a word for at the time. He found a quiet, not peace, not the absence of pain or fear or exhaustion, something below all of those, a point of stillness that held regardless of what was happening to the body above it. He didn't know until later that this was what his grandmother had been trying to describe. He made it through selection. He did not celebrate. He was not the type. Chapter 6. Ghost. The program that took him after selection had no public name. In the circles where such things were spoken of at all, they were called ghosts, not because of any official designation, but because of what they were trained to be: present without being seen, effective without leaving evidence, gone before the story could be told. They operated in the spaces between official narratives, in the geographic and political margins where conventional forces could not go or could not be seen to go. Most people who attempted ghost selection failed. The attrition rate was not spoken of publicly. George never told his family the name of what he had become, because the name was not spoken publicly, and because he came to understand this gradually. Not telling them was a form of protection. What they didn't know couldn't be taken from them. He learned languages. He learned patience as a tactical skill. He learned to read terrain, to read people, to become whatever the mission required in whatever room he was required to be in. He learned to be invisible in plain sight. He was very good at this. Better than almost anyone. His commanders did not say this to him directly, because praise in those circles was expressed as more demanding assignments. He went to places he could not name. He did things he could not describe. He came home sometimes, Thanksgiving, Christmas, his mother's birthday, and sat at the family table and said he was doing well. Things were fine. He was happy with his choice. Don't worry. He was, in fact, happy with his choice. The life was brutal and consuming and often terrible. But it was his, chosen by him, consistent with the person he had discovered himself to be. He had found his something enormous. He lived inside it. His father, at family gatherings and in conversations with peers, described his second son as a soldier, said with a particular neutrality that contained a kind of willed incomprehension. He did not ask what George did. He told people he handles logistics, paperwork, that sort of thing. His voice carried no pride, but also no contempt anymore, just distance, like describing weather in another country. George heard about this secondhand, through Claire, who told him with an expression that asked if he was okay without quite forming the question. He was okay. He understood his father better than his father understood him, and he had made his peace with that asymmetry. Part 3. The Cost. Chapter 7, Afghanistan. The operation had a name that will not be repeated here. There were 14 of them. They had done missions of comparable complexity before, inserted into hostile territory, accomplished objectives of the kind that don't appear in any public report, and extracted without incident. They were experienced. They were disciplined. They were good. Somewhere, someone with access to information, they should not have had passed that information to people who received it with interest. The insertion went cleanly. The approach went cleanly. The first indication that anything was wrong was a wrong sound, wrong direction, arriving wrong, and then everything happened at once in the way catastrophic things do, compressed and simultaneous, without the narrative structure the mind later imposes on chaos. 8 of his teammates died in the engagement that followed. 3 more were wounded critically enough to end their operational careers. A man named Carlos, who had been George's closest friend for 4 years, who had a daughter named Sophia and a laugh like a minor earthquake, lost both legs below the knee. George carried him. This is the detail that was later caught on camera, handheld video, CCTV, the fragmentary footage that emerges after violence, recorded by witnesses who didn't know what they were seeing. A large man, face obscured by dust and blood, carrying another man over broken ground with the focused determination of someone who has decided that stopping is simply not an option. George did not know he had been photographed. He was focused on Carlos, on the weight of him on the next 100 meters, on the extraction point that was ahead somewhere in the gray dawn. He was focused on the voice in his earpiece and the sound of his own breathing and the absolute cellular refusal to put his friend down. He got Carlos to the extraction point. Carlos lived 6 weeks later. After the investigations and the long silences of medical facilities, George submitted his retirement paperwork. His commanding officer did not argue. He shook George's hand and said, "You were one of the best I've ever had. I mean that." George believed him. He walked out into a gray morning and started thinking about what came next. Chapter 8. After. What came next was a security consulting firm, built carefully over 18 months from the relationships George had spent years cultivating, the trust networks of people who had worked in extreme conditions and found each other worthy of that trust. The firm did not advertise. It did not have a flashy website or pursue clients who wanted expense account lunches. It pursued clients who needed real results in complicated circumstances, recommended by people whose recommendations meant something. It worked. Not Calloway family wealthy. That was a different altitude entirely, but comfortable, more importantly, it was his. Built by him, from what he knew, with people he trusted. He carried things from Afghanistan that did not appear in any medical chart. A particular alertness in public spaces, a relationship with sleep that was complicated and inconsistent. Certain sounds, at certain moments, that briefly relocated him somewhere else without his permission. He managed these things with the same practical discipline he applied to everything, not denying them, not indulging them, simply working with what he'd become. He had become someone who had paid for his choices with something real. He did not regret the payment. Part 4. The Birthday. Chapter 9. Eleanor at 80. His grandmother called on a Tuesday. She had a voice that sounded like it had been refined by decades of knowing exactly which words were necessary and which were not. She said, "George, I'm having a small dinner for my birthday. I'd very much like you to come," he said. "I'll be there, Gran," she said. "Good. Then, how are you?" It was a different question in her mouth than in anyone else's. She had loved a soldier. She knew how to ask, "How are you?" in a way that meant I actually want to know, and I am prepared for an honest answer. He said, "Better." "Getting there," she said. "That's enough," and she meant it as reassurance. He booked his flight that afternoon. Chapter 10. The Table. The dinner was at the family home, his parents' house, which looked exactly the same and felt completely different. Perhaps he was the one who was different. Probably both. There were perhaps 20 people. Extended family, long-standing friends, a few of Eleanor's neighbors who had known her for decades. The kind of gathering that is more about presence than occasion. George arrived in a jacket and no tie. He was 31 years old and carried himself with a particular economy of movement that people who have operated in high-risk environments carry forever, like a watermark that doesn't wash out. Eleanor saw him from across the room and crossed to him and held his face in both her hands and looked at him the way she always had, as though reading something written between the lines of his features. "There you are," she said. "Here I am," he said. She held on a moment longer than was strictly grandmotherly, and he understood she was doing what she always did, taking inventory, reading him, checking the places where a soldier who has been in darkness accumulates damage. She nodded once, satisfied with whatever she found, and led him to the table. He was seated across from Anna. Chapter 11. Anna. Anna Reyes had been adjacent to the Calloway family for most of George's life, a family friend's daughter, present at enough significant occasions to be familiar without ever quite coming into focus. She had grown up and become a journalist, a serious one, the kind who went places and asked uncomfortable questions and wrote things that people in power found inconvenient. She was sitting with a glass of wine and the particular alert composure of someone whose profession requires constant low-level absorption of information. She smiled when she saw him, a real smile, unperformed. "George Calloway," she said. "It's been a long time." "Anna," he sat. "You look well. You look like you've been doing something extremely strenuous for a decade," she said, which made him laugh despite himself. Something like that. The table filled around them. Wine was poured. Food arrived. Eleanor sat at the head with the serene authority of a woman who has earned her position at the center of things, and for a while it was simply a good dinner, warm room, familiar voices, the particular ease of people who had known each other long enough to have dropped most of their performances. George sat and ate and listened, and was, for the first time in longer than he could measure, simply present in a room without a mission to accomplish. Chapter 12. The Photograph. It was Richard's friend Gerald, a heavy-set, jovial man who compensated for his own unremarkable career, with enthusiastic interest in the careers of men he admired, who asked the question. Gerald called across the table during a lull, with the beaming generosity of a man about to bestow attention. "What are you up to these days? Richard says you're in. What was it, Richard? Administration? Logistics?" Richard, at the far end of the table, gave a composed smile. "Something like that. Administrative work, paperwork mostly." George reached for his wine. He said nothing. He had said nothing about this for years, and the silence came as naturally to him as breathing. "Important work," Gerald said cheerfully. "Important work." George drank. He looked at the centerpiece, white flowers, candles, the kind of table his mother always set beautifully. He was thinking about nothing in particular, which was something he had trained himself to be able to do in rooms like this. A low hum, a quiet across the table. Anna was not paying attention to Gerald. She had been working a story for months, an investigation into the intelligence failure behind a classified operation in Afghanistan that had nearly wiped out an entire unit, 14 men, 8 dead. She had a source inside the intelligence community who believed the leak had not been accidental. She had been following the money, the chain, the names, carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. That afternoon, her source had delivered a package: CCTV footage, handheld video, fragments of documentation recovered from after the engagement. She had been trying to identify one figure in the footage, a man, large, moving through rubble and early dawn light, carrying another man on his back over broken ground. There was something in the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness even in motion, the way he kept his body between the man he was carrying and every possible angle of threat. She had opened the images on her phone under the table. She brought the screen up to look more closely in the lamplight. She looked at George. She looked at the image. Her breath left her body all at once, quietly, without drama, the way the air goes out of a room when a window breaks. She looked at George again. He was already watching her. He had been watching since she picked up her phone, not visibly, not in any way the table could have noticed, but watching in the way he had been trained to watch everything in every room he ever entered. He had seen the shift in her expression. He had seen the recognition arrive. He was very still. George. The voice was Claire's. His sister had leaned over, alarmed by something in Anna's face, because Claire had always been quick about things that alarmed her, and she had looked at the phone in Anna's hand. She had looked at it for only a second. 1 second, then she looked at her brother. Her face opened like a wound. George, her voice came out wrong, too high, stripped of all the control she usually had. Is that you? The table turned. 20 people. Mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-laugh, all of them turned toward the sound. And what they saw was Claire, who was always composed, always steady, staring at her brother with an expression none of them had ever seen on her face before. Her hand was pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to hold something in. George set down his wine glass, very slowly, very carefully. He did not look at the image. He knew what was in the image. He looked at Anna. The silence at that table was not the silence of a dinner party that has been surprised. It was a different kind, heavier, with a quality of irreversibility, the silence of a room that understands something has just changed and cannot be unchanged. Anna, George said. His voice was quiet and very controlled. Where did you get those images? Part 5, what was known at last at Chapter 13, the room that changed. Anna turned the phone face down on the table. Around her, the room held its breath. Patricia Calloway, George's mother, had put her hand over her mouth. She had done it involuntarily, the gesture of a woman whose body understands something before her mind has finished processing it. She was looking at her son the way you look at a person you thought you knew the shape of and have suddenly discovered is much larger than you realized, and the enormity is not reassuring. It is terrifying, because if he is that much larger, then the danger was that much larger too, and she had spent 8 years telling herself the danger was not so bad. The danger was administrative. The danger was paperwork. Richard Calloway had gone completely still, at the far end of the table. He was looking at his son, not with anger, not with the distant disappointment that had characterized the last 8 years of their relationship. He was looking at George with an expression that no one at that table had ever seen Richard Calloway wear, because Richard Calloway did not allow himself to look afraid in front of people. And yet there it was, unmistakably moving through his face like weather. He was afraid. He was looking at his son, and he was afraid, and it was not the fear of the present moment. It was a fear that had been living quietly in him for years, sealed off, kept in the dark where he didn't have to look at it, the fear that the thing he had refused to know was exactly as bad as the part of him that did know had always suspected. Paperwork, he had told people. Administration. He had not said it because he was ashamed of his son. He had said it because if he said the real thing, he would have to live every day knowing the real thing. He would have to pick up the phone every time it rang and wonder. He was not looking at his plate now. He was not looking away. He was looking at George with 8 years of willful blindness stripped out of him all at once. And what was left was a father looking at his son, really looking. For perhaps the first time since George walked out the front door, Marcus sat beside his wife and did not speak. He was looking at the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. He was a man who had spent 8 years making the same jokes, paperwork, orders from idiots, running around screaming, and he was currently engaged in the very private, very uncomfortable process of understanding what those words had actually cost, what they had said about who he was. He could feel his wife looking at him, but he could not look back at her yet. Gerald, jovial, well-meaning Gerald, who had smiled across this table 20 minutes ago and said important work, was looking at George with his mouth slightly open. The expression of a man who has made a joke at a funeral without knowing there was a funeral. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. She was the only person in the room whose expression had not changed. She looked at her grandson with the still, complete attention she had been giving him since he was a boy in her kitchen holding a photograph. She had always known. Not the specific details, not Afghanistan, not the name they didn't name publicly, not the 14 men or the 8 deaths, but she had known what he carried when he walked into rooms. She had recognized it the way you recognize a language you grew up hearing. Her husband had walked into rooms the same way. She looked at George, and her face held something that was not quite pride, and not quite grief, but was made of both things in equal measure. George looked around the table. He looked at all of them, his mother with her hand pressed over her mouth, his father stripped of his armor. Looking back at him, his sister with tears running down her face, that she was not trying to stop, his brother unable to meet his eyes. The guests who had laughed and eaten and talked all evening and were now understanding they had been sitting at a table with someone they had profoundly misunderstood. He looked at Anna last. "Where did you get them?" he asked again. And his voice, which had held its quiet control through all of it, was asking something underneath the question, something that had nothing to do with the images. Anna understood. She had been a journalist long enough to understand when a source needed to trust her. But she was also a person, sitting across from a man she had underestimated for 30 years, and she was looking at him now with eyes that were open all the way. "I got them from a source inside the intelligence community," she said. Her voice was steady, measured. "Someone who believes the leak that caused this operation to fail was not accidental, that someone allowed it to happen or made it happen." She paused. "I've been investigating for 4 months. I didn't know you were in those images." The table was absolutely silent. "Who else has them?" George said. "My source, myself, and now the people in this room." "Have you published?" "No. I don't publish until I have the complete chain. Names, evidence, documentation. I never publish incomplete." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once. "We need to talk," he said, "not here." "I know," she said. Chapter 14, after the table cleared. The dinner did not really resume after that. The food was there. The plates were there. People picked up their forks and set them down again. Conversation started and stalled. Gerald drank his wine and was very quiet, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the whole evening. The guests began to drift toward the garden, toward the living room, toward the tactful dispersal that happens when a room has held too much weight and people need to put it down somewhere. Within 40 minutes, only family remained. Eleanor stayed in her chair and let the night settle around her. Patricia Calloway went to her son. She did not say anything for a moment. She stood in front of him in the dining room doorway, smaller than he remembered from childhood, and she looked at his face the way mothers look at their children when they are checking them for damage. The way she had looked at him when he was 7 and fell off his bicycle, when he was 12 and had a fever. She had been doing this every time he came home. He understood that now. Every holiday, every visit, the careful questions, the small talk about socks and phone numbers, the deliberate avoidance of anything that went too deep. She had been checking him for damage every single time and making herself look away before she could see too much. She was not looking away now. "How many times?" she whispered. Her voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a woman asking something she is not sure she can bear the answer to, but asking anyway, because not knowing is worse. "How many times were you in something like that?" George looked at his mother, at the lines that had come into her face in the years he had been away, at the gray she had stopped coloring out of her hair 2 years ago, which Claire had told him about on the phone, like it was a small thing, though they both understood it was not. "Mom, don't tell me it was fine," she said. "Don't do that to me. Not tonight." He was quiet for a moment. "More than once," he said, because she had asked for honesty, and she deserved it, and he was done not giving it. "Not like that. Nothing like that again. But more than once." Patricia Calloway closed her eyes. She held them closed for a long time. When she opened them, she took his face in both hands just as Eleanor had done, and he wondered if his grandmother had taught her this. or if this was simply what the women in this family did with him, read him with their hands because their eyes could only see the surface. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. I would have been scared every day. I know that's why." She pressed her forehead against his and stood there for a while, both of them very still. "I'm scared every day anyway," she finally said. "I just didn't know what I was scared of." He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. He put his arms around her, and she let herself cry, the real crying, the kind she had been holding back for years, the kind that makes no sound because it is too large for sound. He held her until it passed. Chapter 15. He found his father in the garden. Richard Calloway was standing near the string lights Patricia had always wanted, and he had finally installed 3 summers ago, looking out into the dark past the fence. He had his jacket on again, which meant he had needed to put his armor back on after losing it at the table. George understood this. He understood his father's relationship with armor. He stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The garden was quiet. Crickets, the far sound of a neighbor's television. Ordinary things. "I told Gerald you did paperwork," Richard said finally. He said it to the dark, not to George. "I know. I've been telling people that for 8 years. A pause. The word that followed cost him something. "Why did you let me?" George looked at the lights along the fence. "Because correcting you would have required explaining what I actually did, and I couldn't explain what I actually did. You could have said enough, could I?" George looked at his father. "Could I have said I do things I can't tell you about, in places I can't name, with people whose names I won't use, and had that be better than paperwork? For you?" Richard was quiet for a long time. "No," he said at last. "I don't suppose you could have." He turned and looked at his son, really looked the way he had at the table, armor stripped away. George saw it again, the fear, not of George, not of this conversation. The fear of a man who had grown up the son of a soldier who didn't come home, who had spent his whole adult life building walls of money and certainty and success, specifically so that the world could not take what he loved the way it had taken his father. And then his second son had walked directly into the fire he had spent 30 years building walls against. "I told myself," Richard said slowly, like a man reading something written in a language he is just learning, "that you were being reckless, that it was stubbornness, a boy who wanted to go against his father for the sake of going against him." He stopped. "I told myself it wasn't real, that you were too smart to actually be in danger, that it was that you were safe, because if you believed I wasn't safe," George said, "you would have had to feel it." The muscle in his father's jaw moved. "Yes," he said. It came out rough, torn at the edges, the voice of a man who did not say difficult things and was saying one now. "Yes, because I had already felt it once. When they came to your grandmother's door, I was 6 years old and I watched my mother's face and I understood that the thing I was most afraid of could actually happen. He stopped. He looked at the lights. "I decided I would never be in that position. I would not love anything I could lose to a war. And then your brother came, and your sister came, and you came, and it turned out you can't decide that. You just love them, and there it is, and you are afraid." George had not known until this moment that his father had been 6 years old when his grandfather died. He had known the absence, the folded flag, the woman who built her life around a hole in the shape of her husband. He had not known the boy standing in the doorway watching his mother understand. He had not known he and his father had been shaped by the same absence. "Why did you become a businessman?" George asked, not as an accusation, as something genuine. Richard almost smiled. It was a sad thing, that almost smile, because it was the farthest thing from a soldier I could think of, because I wanted a life where the worst thing that happened was a bad quarter. He looked at his son, and instead I had a son who he stopped. "Who was the closest thing to him you ever produced?" George said quietly. Richard's eyes went bright. He looked away. They stood in the garden for a long time. Neither of them could fix 12 years in a single night, and both of them were old enough to know it. But something had shifted, some tectonic thing, some plate that had been locked against another for years, had moved, not resolved, moved. Richard put his hand on his son's shoulder. He said, "I'm sorry I called it paperwork. I know why you did. That's not the point." His father's grip tightened slightly. "It wasn't about paperwork. It was about the fact that I couldn't." He stopped again. "Then you were in Afghanistan, George. You carried a man out of a..." His voice broke. "Just once, briefly." He put it back together. "You did that and came home and sat at my table and I asked you nothing. You weren't ready to know. You deserved to be asked. His father looked at him with the directness of a man who has been in business for 30 years and understands that some things need to be said without softening. Whatever I was or wasn't ready for. You deserved to be asked. I'm sorry. George stood in the garden in the dark, with his father's hand on his shoulder, and he thought about his grandfather, Thomas, the man he had been trying to reach for since he was 7 years old in his grandmother's kitchen. He thought about Eleanor's saying, to be small in yourself, but part of something enormous. He thought about all the dinners and holidays and brief visits when his father had looked at him from across the distance they had built together, and neither of them had found the bridge. He would have been proud, George said, grandfather, of both of us. Richard's throat moved. I know, he said, very quietly, with all of his considerable control pressed into keeping his voice level. I know he would have. They stood there until the night got cold, and neither of them moved. Chapter 16, Marcus. Marcus found him near the kitchen, in the narrow hallway where the family had always congregated during parties when they needed a moment away from the room. He looked different than he had at the table. The vice presidential composure had gone somewhere. What was left was his brother, the actual one under the suit and the performance, a man in his mid-30s who was holding something heavy and didn't know what to do with it. I said you filled out paperwork, Marcus said. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was stating a fact, the way you state the thing you need to take responsibility for before you can get to the responsibility part. I said you ran around screaming. I said he stopped, pressed his lips together. I said it at the table and to Dad's friends and to colleagues when they asked. I made it a joke. I know, George said. I didn't know what he caught himself. That doesn't matter. Whether I knew or not, I was saying it about my brother. I was choosing to make it small, because it was easier than, he stopped. Being afraid for me, George said. Marcus looked at him. His jaw was working the same way his father's had. You're my little brother, he said, and the words came out stripped of all their usual varnish, raw. You've always been my little brother and I was. He stopped again, and George watched him fight the thing that wanted to come out before finally letting it. When Claire screamed your name and showed that picture, for a second I thought, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. George had seen enough of death to know what it looked like when someone understood, for the first time, that a person they loved had been standing very close to it for a very long time. I'm here, George said simply. I'm standing here. I know. Marcus pressed his fingers against his eyes briefly, a gesture George had never seen his brother make. I know you are. He dropped his hand, looked at his brother directly without the usual machinery between them. I'm sorry for all of it, the jokes, the contempt when you left, telling Dad it was a waste. I was 24 years old, and I thought I understood what courage looked like, because I'd read it in business books, and he held out his hand. George looked at it. He took it. They shook hands the way men who have been raised to not show their feeling to each other shake hands when what they mean is something much larger. And then Marcus pulled him in, and they held on briefly, and neither of them said anything about it afterward. Chapter 17, Claire. Claire was in the garden when he found her, sitting on the bench near the far fence where they had spent childhood summers doing nothing in particular. She had her knees drawn up and was looking at the string lights with the red eyes of someone who has been crying without trying to stop it. She heard him come and made room on the bench without looking up. He sat beside her. I always knew something was different, she said after a while. When you came home, the way you sat in rooms, the way you watched doors. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands. I told myself it was just the military, that they all came back like that. Some of them do, George said. I didn't let myself think about what it meant. She looked at him now, and her face was completely unguarded, no composure, no management, just his sister looking at him. In that picture, George, you were covered in blood. Not all of it was mine. I know. Her voice fractured on the word. I know it wasn't yours, and that's almost worse somehow, because she shook her head. I hugged you in the hallway when you left and told you to take real care of yourself, and then I went back down the hall and let you go. And you went to, you were in, Claire. He said her name the way you say someone's name when you need them to come back from the edge of something. Quiet, steady. She heard it. She took a breath. Tell me one thing, she said. Not details. Just one thing that's true. He thought about this for a moment. It mattered, he said. What I was doing, it mattered. I was where I was supposed to be. She looked at him for a long time. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder the way she used to when they were children, when the house was loud and she needed something solid. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." They sat like that until the lights in the garden began to go out one by one as the night turned late and the house settled into quiet around them. Chapter 18. Eleanor. He went to his grandmother last. She was still in her chair in the corner of the now quiet living room. Most of the guests had gone. The room had the particular stillness of aftermath. Plates collected, glasses washed, the evening done. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and looked at him when he came in and said nothing. He sat across from her. The quiet between them was different from all the other quiets that night. It was not heavy. It was not charged with guilt or fear or the weight of things unsaid. It was simply the quiet of two people who have always understood each other. "You knew," George said, not an accusation. "I suspected," she said, "since you were about 25. The way you moved when you came home. Thomas moved like that." She paused. "I wasn't certain until tonight." "Why didn't you say anything? What would I have said?" She looked at him with those eyes still, patient, carrying everything they had always carried. "You were doing what you had decided to do, what you were called to do. It wasn't mine to question." A pause, and it wasn't mine to make harder than it already was. George looked at his grandmother, at the 80 years in her face, at the life she had built around an absence, and built it into something whole and warm anyway. This family, these dinners, this table, this birthday. "I was trying to be like him," George said quietly. "That's where it started. Your stories, the photograph." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're not like him, George." He looked at her. "Thomas was a good man who became a soldier," she said. "You were something rarer. You were always a soldier. It was already in you." Thomas would have recognized it in an instant. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. "He would have been proud beyond what I know how to tell you." He sat with his grandmother in the quiet room for a long time, and something in him that had been held at a certain tension for years. A readiness, a bracing, released, slowly, like a breath he had been holding since he was 7 years old in her kitchen, finding a photograph in the drawer. He had been trying to reach his grandfather his entire life. Sitting here in this quiet, with this woman's hand over his, he understood that he had. Part 6. The Ghost Comes Home. Chapter 19. Anna. After, he called her 3 days later. She had sent him the morning after the dinner a carefully written message. "I want you to know the images are secure. I will not publish anything without your knowledge, and I would not publish those images at all, regardless. I'm not interested in exposing what you were. I am interested in the chain that caused that operation to fail. The people who sold those coordinates. If you're willing to share what you know, I would value it. If not, I understand completely. Either way, what I know about you stays with me." He read the message 4 times in the early morning quiet of his home office, the stillness that was his most comfortable state. He read it 4 times and then set the phone down and looked at the wall. She had said, "What I know about you stays with me." Not as leverage, not as reassurance designed to extract something from him. She had said it the way his grandmother spoke, with the economy of someone who only says what they mean. He called her on the 3rd day. "I've been trying to find who leaked our position for 2 years, he said. "I have part of the chain. You have another part." "Yes," she said. "If we combine them, we might complete it." "Yes," she said again. "I'm not a source," he said carefully. "Whatever I give you has to be used in ways that protect the people I care about. My team, Carlos, the ones who survived." "Understood," she said. "I work with sources who have conditions. That's legitimate. That's how this should work." A pause. "I'd like to meet," he said. "So would I," she said. Chapter 20. The Investigation. They met over coffee the following week and then again and then again. It was professional at first, the careful process of 2 experienced people learning whether they could trust each other. George brought what he had, fragments of intelligence gathered over 2 years through the network of people who had trusted him with their lives and been trusted with his. A partial map of how the information might have moved, who had access, which channels had been compromised. Anna brought the rest. She was meticulous, her documentation precise, her sourcing impeccable, her understanding of the geopolitical context deeper than he had expected. She had been doing this for a long time. She was very good at it. They filled each other's gaps. By the 3rd meeting, they had the shape of what had happened, a contractor, 2 intermediaries, a payment route designed to be invisible, and almost was. By the 6th meeting, They had enough for Anna to bring to a specific investigative committee through channels that would insulate George's identity and protect his former colleagues completely. By the 8th meeting, he had stopped counting the meetings. Chapter 21. What grew between them? It did not announce itself. It was not the kind of thing that announces itself when it grows between two people who are both accustomed to paying close attention to their surroundings. It was in the way she laughed when he said something unexpected, a real laugh arriving with the slight surprise of someone who didn't see it coming. It was in the way he found himself extending the ends of their meetings without any professional justification he could name. The way she remembered, 2 weeks after he had mentioned it in passing, that he took his coffee without sugar. The way he noticed, and said nothing about noticing, that she always positioned herself with her back to the wall in unfamiliar spaces, and recognized this as the professional habit of someone who had spent years in rooms where the exits mattered. He trusted her. This was not a small thing for George Calloway. He trusted perhaps 7 people on the earth with any meaningful portion of himself, and he had earned each of those relationships through years of shared extreme circumstance. He had not expected to trust someone new. He had not thought he had room for it. He was wrong about that. She saw him. Not the version he presented to rooms, the contained, watchful version that most people received. She saw the person underneath, the boy from his grandmother's kitchen, the man who had carried a friend over broken ground in the gray dawn and refused to put him down, the person who had paid for his choices with something real and did not regret the payment. She saw all of it and did not look away. Chapter 22. Carlos. He took her once to meet Carlos. Carlos Martinez lived in a good house with his wife Rosa and his daughter Sofia, who was 7 years old and had her father's laugh, the one like a minor earthquake. He had prosthetic legs that he navigated with the same practical, stubborn efficiency he brought to everything, and he had started an organization for veterans that consumed most of his considerable energy. He shook Anna's hand and looked at her with the direct appraisal of a man who had spent years in environments where reading people accurately was not a professional skill, but a survival requirement. Then he looked at George with an expression that contained approximately 9 things, most of them affectionate. "It's about time," Carlos said. "We're not," George started. "It is about time," Carlos said firmly, and took them both inside to have dinner with his family. Later, when Anna was helping Sofia with something at the other end of the house, Carlos sat beside George on the back porch, with 2 beers and the quiet of men who have been through enough together that silence has its own grammar. "She's good," Carlos said. "I know. She looked at me like I was a person." Carlos said it simply, as a statement of fact, without self-pity. Not a story, not a symbol, a person. He looked at his beer. "She's good." George looked at the dark backyard. "She sees people," he said. "It's what she does, the work she does. She sees what's actually there, including you, including me." Carlos was quiet for a moment. Then, "The ones we lost in Afghanistan." He said it carefully, the way you carry something fragile. "If she gets the people responsible, she will," George said. "She will get them." Carlos nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, at the man he had become, on the other side of a mountain in the gray dawn, carried by his friend who had refused to put him down. "Good," he said. It came out rough. "Good." They sat on the porch until Rosa called them in, and neither of them said anything else about it, which meant they had said everything. Chapter 23. The question. He asked her on an ordinary evening. No elaborate architecture, no staging. They were in his apartment after dinner, in the easy aftermath of it, and she was reading something on her laptop and he was looking at her. The lamplight was on her. She had her feet tucked up underneath her on the couch, which was a thing he had observed that she did when she was comfortable when her guard was all the way down. He said, "Marry me?" She looked up. He said, "I know what I am. I know what I was and what it left me with. I know this is not a simple thing I'm offering you." He looked at her steadily. "But I want to build something with you. I want to try." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then, "I've known what you were since before you knew I was paying attention." A pause. "I've been paying attention to you for longer than is probably dignified." "Anna," "Yes," she said, clearly, without hesitation. He crossed the room and sat beside her, and she put her hand on his face the way his grandmother had, the way his mother had, the gesture of a person reading what was really there, and he understood that this was what home was. Not the house he had grown up in, not the place his father had built, A person who saw everything that was true about him and chose it anyway, deliberately, with her eyes open all the way. Yes, she said again, to make sure he had heard. He had heard. Part 7. After the Ghost. Chapter 24. The wedding. The wedding was not large. George did not do large, and Anna, who had spent years in rooms where large gatherings were professionally dangerous, did not want large. It was small and deliberate and real. A room of people who had earned the right to be there. The family came, all of them. Patricia cried from the moment she arrived and denied it for the rest of the day. Eleanor sat in the seat of honor and watched the whole proceedings with the expression she wore when she was satisfied, the particular stillness that contained everything she had ever hoped for and hadn't needed to say. Claire gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and contained more genuine emotion per word than most speeches, 10 times its length. She said, "George has spent his whole life being exactly who he is without asking anyone's permission, and the rest of us took a long time to catch up. But I think we're here now." No one argued with this. Marcus stood at the end of the toasts and said something that was slightly too long and tried a little too hard in the way Marcus's things tended to. But buried in the middle of it was something that silenced the room. He said, "I spent a lot of years making my brother smaller because his size scared me. I'm not going to do that anymore." He looked at George when he said it, and George looked back, and that was all that needed to happen. Richard Calloway did not give a speech. He came to his son before the ceremony, in the small room where George was getting ready, and he stood in the doorway for a moment. He was holding himself differently than he used to. Something had gone out of the careful arrangement he always composed himself into. Something had left room for something else. He said, "Your grandfather walked into every room like he was exactly where he was supposed to be." He looked at his son. "You walk the same way? I want you to know I see that. I've seen it for a long time." George looked at his father. "I know," he said. Richard nodded once. Then he walked forward and pulled his son into an embrace, the real kind, with his whole weight in it, the kind that says everything words have already tried to say and not quite reached. George held on. When they separated, Richard straightened his jacket and walked out without turning around, which was the most emotionally honest thing George had ever seen his father do. Chapter 25. What everyone knew now. In the weeks and months that followed Eleanor's birthday, the truth spread through the family the way truth spread. Not all at once, but in conversations, in quieter moments, in the particular recalibration that happens when people discover they have fundamentally misread someone they love. Gerald, at a subsequent gathering, asked again what George did, out of habit, before realizing the conversation had changed. Richard looked at his friend, and then at his son across the room, and then back. George ran special operations, Richard said. Classified. The kind of work that doesn't have a public name. He was one of the best they had. A pause. Now he runs a security firm. Gerald blinked. "I thought you said I was wrong about what I said," Richard said simply, and left it there. There was a pride in his voice that he did not moderate or contain. George, across the room, heard it. He said nothing. He looked at his wineglass for a moment and felt something settle in him, some weight that had been distributed unevenly for a very long time, finding, finally, its balance. His mother watched him from across the room with the expression of a woman who has been afraid for years and has decided to stop performing the absence of fear. She was still afraid, in the way she would always be afraid for the people she loved. But she had stopped pretending she wasn't. This was its own kind of courage, and he recognized it as such. Claire texted him that week, "Dad told 3 separate people at the Hendersons' party what you really were." He said it like it was the thing he was most proud of. George read this in his car before going inside his office. He sat with it for a moment. Then he texted back, "Good?" He meant it. Chapter 26. The investigation's end. Honest Peace ran on a Tuesday morning. It had taken 14 months from Eleanor's birthday. 14 months of careful, methodical construction, source verification, legal review, committee briefings, and the kind of patience that separates good journalism from reckless journalism. It named the contractor who had sold the coordinates. It named the intermediaries. It named the officials who had looked away, and the one who had not merely looked away but facilitated. It named the chain, complete, documented, irrefutable. George read it in his office in the early morning quiet, with the lamp on and the rest of the building dark. He read it twice. He read it the way you read something that has taken years to arrive, slowly, and with the full weight of knowing what it cost. 3 people lost their positions within a week of publication. 1 faced a criminal investigation. The security protocols that had failed were overhauled at the highest levels. Carlos texted him 2 hours after the piece went live. She got them. George sat in his office for a while after that, with his phone on the desk and the lamp on and the city beginning to wake up outside the window. He thought about 8 men. He thought about their names, which he carried and would always carry. He thought about the gray dawn on a mountain, and the weight of a friend over his shoulders, and the absolute decision not to stop. He thought about what it meant that the chain was complete now, that it was named, that the silence he had maintained for 2 years while carrying that weight had been worth maintaining, because it had protected the chain until the chain could be handed to someone who knew what to do with it. He got up. He went to the kitchen. He made coffee without sugar and brought it back to where Anna was still asleep in the next room and set it on the nightstand for when she woke up. Then he stood in the doorway and looked at her for a while, at the life they were building, at what remained on the other side of everything it had cost to get here. She stirred, opened her eyes, saw him in the doorway. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She sat up and took the coffee, and he sat beside her. And for a while, they were simply 2 people in a room in the early morning, with the ordinary light coming through the curtains and the ordinary sounds of the city waking around them. It was enough. It was more than enough. Epilogue. The ghost at rest. There is a particular quality to the life of a man who has come through the kind of darkness George Calloway came through. Not a life of peace, exactly, because peace is not really the right word. Something more honest than peace. A life of presence, of being genuinely, fully here, in the room you are in with the people who are in it, because you have spent enough time in rooms where presence was the only thing standing between someone living and dying, and you understand what it means to not waste it. He still carried the ones who didn't come home. He would always carry them. He had made his peace with that, the way soldiers make their peace with things they cannot change, not by forgetting, but by making room, by building a life large enough that the grief had somewhere to live that wasn't the whole of it. There were new things, too. The firm, which grew quietly and steadily and well. A marriage to a woman who understood that truth was worth whatever it cost to pursue it. A family that had found its way slowly, imperfectly, in the human way of families, toward something more honest than it had been before one evening in a dining room when a photograph exposed everything. And Eleanor, who called on Tuesdays and asked, "How are you?" in the way that meant the real question. He had started giving her the real answer. Better, he would say, better all the time, and she would say, good. That's more than enough. He would look at whatever room he was in, his office, his kitchen, his car waiting at a light, and he would feel the thing he had been searching for since he was 7 years old, sitting in his grandmother's kitchen with a photograph of a man he would never get to meet. The something enormous. It had been there from the beginning, in the choosing of the life no one else could have chosen for him, in the people who had trusted him with their lives and found him worthy. In the truth that was finally told about 8 men on a mountain, on a gray morning, in a country far from home. In the justice that came years later, slow and difficult and real. In the woman who left his coffee on the nightstand, in the father who finally said his son's name out loud and meant every syllable of it. In the grandmother who had held the story safe in her careful hands since long before George knew he was living it, who had always known how it would go, who had been patient enough to outlast the years it took everyone else to catch up. George Calloway, ghost, soldier, home.